As many of you probably know, street photography is an extremely complicated art form that often involves split-second decision making. But this level of complexity is no excuse for poorly exposing your photos. Getting an accurate exposure reading of your scene can make a significant impact in the quality and visual language of your street photos. And this is true regardless of whether you use a film or digital camera. There are many metering options out there for street photographers, from classics like this to even apps on your phone. But one of the most popular options for street photographers has to be the shoe-mounted meter. And this is because they are easy to read, simple to operate, and offer a low-profile design, which can often integrate very naturally onto older cameras that lack internal light metering systems. But actually, I found that using these shoe-mounted meters off the cameras themselves can have some great advantages when it comes to street photography. And I even often meter like this with my film cameras that feature integrated light metering systems like my Leica MP, or digital cameras like my Leica M9 that don't offer a real-time preview. With so many metering options, let alone shoe-mounted meters available lately, I wanted to explain why I prefer the Voigtlander VC Meter 2 and dive into how I use it to take street photos like these. I'm David, and this is the whole picture. Simply put, what I mean by using the VC meter off of my camera is to hold it in my hand rather than stick it to my camera, and then often store it in a pocket or bag when I'm not using it, and a little bit more on this later. This metering method, as well as the reasoning behind using the Voigtlander VC2, came from many years experimenting in street photography with a variety of different gear. But it really solidified when I started using an older Rolleiflex that lacked a built-in light metering system. This forced me to keep the VC meter in a pocket or bag, which admittedly at first was pretty inconvenient, as I often had to fumble for it every time I wanted to meter. And I quickly realized how trying to do so would lead to many missed opportunities when it came to street photography. So I took to metering light well before taking any photographs, and rather than metering before each exposure, learned to trust my judgment after collecting some information with the Voigtlander VC Meter 2. More specifically, when I arrived on scene, I would meter the brightest areas, typically the sky, then the darkest shadows, and finally try to get a general reading of the ambient light. Of course, it is possible to meter in a similar way with the Voigtlander VC2 mounted to your camera, and I'll touch on this a little bit later, but I found it much more convenient and less distracting to use the actual meter itself rather than mounted to the camera. After all, it is quite small and actually fits well in the hand, with the shoe mount and shutter speed dial providing some grip. But at the same time, since the Voigtlander VC Meter 2 has a 30-degree photometry angle, when you have it on a camera that's, say, hung around your neck, the meter only reads a small window, which might not give you the most accurate representation of your entire scene's lighting conditions. This is especially true when you're using wider angle lenses, so metering several different areas of your scene can help compensate for the wider angle of view that your camera is seeing. For example, take this tunnel scene. If you simply pointed the meter straight ahead of you, the reading would be for the light that is outside of the tunnel. But if you're using wider angle lenses, your frame would include parts of the interior of the tunnel, and so your photo would subsequently have thin shadows that might be pitch black or muddy and contain very little information. But without moving the camera, if you turn the meter 90 degrees, you would then get a more accurate reading for the inside of the tunnel, but now the scene outside would be very dense and overexposed, even possibly to the point where it's blown out and unrecoverable. A third reading could be pointed forward but downwards, to include both some of the shadows from inside the tunnel and light from outside. By metering several sections of the scene before actually taking a photograph, we can choose one of the settings, or blend several of them together to suit the scene, desired effect, or our current equipment best. This technique works in most scenarios, indoors or out, day or night. Now, with that mental note of our various light meter readings, it's much easier to set or adjust our exposure as we're photographing, all without the need to meter and make decisions in the crucial moments before pressing the shutter. And just to clarify, going back to that earlier example, the light reading that we would get taken from inside the tunnel but of the outside ambient light would be sufficient for other areas of the environment with similar lighting conditions, but the shadows that are inside the tunnel will not be the same exposure as, say, the shadows cast by a tree or building that are outside of the tunnel. And so when my environment changes drastically enough, I will once again take the meter out of my pocket and measure those most common lighting conditions that typically appear in my street photos. But of course, these techniques can be applied to the light meter that's already inside of your camera or a light meter that's on your phone, so why do I continue to use the Voigtlander VC2? Well, I found that using the VC Meter 2, and particularly using it off of my camera, has several practical benefits when it comes to street photography, first of which is that it's not distracting to me, the photographer. That might sound a bit strange, but hear me out. When I kept this meter on the shoe of my camera, because it was always so accessible, I often felt compelled to meter mere moments before taking a photograph, just in case the light changed ever so slightly, or even just to be more confident in my exposure. But with the dynamics of street scenes changing so quickly, I found myself often missing the opportunity to take a photograph because I was fiddling with my exposure settings. And you can even occasionally run into a situation, like with the tunnel or other backlit scenarios, where rushing to meter before taking a photo could lead to you taking a reading of the brightest areas of the scene, which is great for a silhouette type photo, but can ruin a photo if what you wanted was the details in the shadows. You're rarely afforded the necessary time to consider these aspects of street photography, let alone meter and execute with perfect timing and framing, all in a short moment. By metering well before taking any photographs, I became more prepared to make those snap decisions on exposure and began to trust my judgment on a scene, rather than worrying whether it should be f5.6 or f8 and consulting the meter. And this also led to the added benefit of more creative exposures in my street photography. Again, here with an easily accessible meter, whether it's shoe mounted or integrated into your finder, I found it very easy to fall into the trap of just doing exactly what the meter says without thinking. But the thing is, exposure and lighting can have a profound effect on the visual language behind your street photos, and I found that leaving this kind of creative decision making up to automation or a quick glance at a meter to be insufficient. This is also in part my reasoning behind metering this way with the Voigtlander VC2, even when using cameras like the Leica MP or M9. Even though they have built-in light meters, I'd rather be prepared and not distracted or fiddling with exposure settings when presented with a once-in-a-lifetime photo opportunity. Another one of my reasonings is that metering through the finder or with this meter on the shoe of your camera can be distracting to the subjects of your street photos. It depends on your style, but I'd say more often than not, the goal of a street photographer is to discreetly capture a poetic or unique moment in daily life without affecting or over-influencing the subject or scene. The problem, of course, being that putting the camera to your eye like this or pointing it in someone's direction for any prolonged amount of time can influence them to act in a way that is not natural, thus influencing the scene before you actually get a chance to capture it. Combined with the previously mentioned distraction to the photographer, I found pre-metering with the Voigtlander VC Meter 2 by hand to be a successful way to capture these unique moments in everyday life more naturally and quickly, and it has the added benefit of over time having trained my eye to read light better, to the point where I often even feel comfortable choosing exposure settings without any kind of meter at all. Of course, my judgment isn't always going to be perfect, so I do like having one of these meters around as a reference point, and it can technically be any meter, but I find the size and ease of use of the Voigtlander VC Meter 2 to be particularly helpful when it comes to street photography. The VC2 is on the smaller side when it comes to light meters, which does make it more discreet to use and easy to always have with you. One might argue that by that logic for street photography, an app on your phone could be the best meter, as you always have it with you, and while an app on a phone could be great for street photographers, after all, it blends in a little bit better with our society's norms, I found that there's one last feature of the Voigtlander VC Meter 2 that keeps me coming back to it versus the competition. These 5 lines that accompany the shutter and aperture dials provide valuable alternative exposure information. I find this information very helpful when it comes to street photography, as it lets me quickly get a grasp on the limitations of my current lighting situation, as well as what kind of compromises I can make to achieve different styles of photographs. With just one reading, I get enough information to easily go from, say, a shallow depth of field or fast shutter style to a deep focus or slow shutter style without the need to meter again. Now, while this is something that you can fairly easily figure out on your own, I found that having it provided for you can help free up some mental energy so that you can concentrate on timing, framing, and focus if need be. So this kind of feature is yet another reason I still carry the VC Meter 2 around with me, even when using a very advanced camera like the Mamiya 6. While it has a great built-in light metering system as well as automatic exposure functionality, the Voigtlander VC Meter 2 does give me more information while being less distracting and doesn't disturb my scene nearly as much as metering through the viewfinder of the large Mamiya 6. Other than that, I found the ISO range of 25 to 3200 to probably be able to cover most people's needs when it comes to street photography, and same goes for the aperture and shutter range, at least when it comes to 35mm and most medium format setups. I did use this VC Meter 2 for some 4x5 street photography, and when it comes to large format or some specialty medium format lenses, some people might find the aperture range to be insufficient. As there's no exposure compensation on this, I tend to use the ISO dial as an alternative, and even then found that the range was still very much acceptable. The Voigtlander VC Meter 2 is powered by 2 LR44 batteries, which is great because they're fairly common in most parts of the world and can even be bought at convenience stores here in Japan. But I do have to admit that if you pocket the meter like I do, you might find batteries loose in your pocket and the meter not functioning when you need it most. A little bit of tape does solve this problem, but the loose battery door does seem to be a fairly common issue with this meter, and it's something that I think newer competitors to the VC Meter 2 address in a much better way. At the end of the day, while there are many options out there that are equally as good, I stick with the Voigtlander VC 2 because it fits my needs and works for me. I've used it for travel, street, portraits, you name it. And to wrap things up and back to an earlier point, I spent many years experimenting with different kinds of cameras and metering solutions, various styles of street photography, and really found that this Voigtlander VC2 and the way I use it suits my style of street photography, whether I'm shooting at box speed, pushing or pulling, or even using a digital camera like the Leica M9, but your results may vary. So I do advise anyone that picks one of these up and intends to use it on a serious project to do a lot of testing beforehand. I do think it says a lot though that many of the new competitors to the Voigtlander VC Meter 2 share a lot of its design notes and functionality, which I think shows why these shoe-mounted meters are so popular and functional for street photographers. Anyways, I hope you liked the video. I'm David, and this is The Whole Picture.